Welcome to another lecture by MedicoMedics, Learning Made Easy. Anatomy, Chapter 10, the Reproductive System. In this lecture, we will cover the functions and the anatomy of the male and female reproductive systems. We will discuss gametogenesis, hormonal regulation, the menstrual cycle. Further, we will continue on talking about fertilization and pregnancy, childbirth and lactation. Look at some diagnostic tools and end with a summary. Now with a brief overview of the functions of the reproductive system. This is where we study the production of gametes, so sperm and egg, facilitation of fertilization, the support for fetal development, specifically in females, hormonal regulation of reproductive processes. Now let's begin with the anatomy of the male reproductive system. As in the rest of our anatomy courses, we include smaller bits of physiology and function, and even pathophysiology to broaden your conceptual understanding of the different anatomic structures. So let's continue in that fashion, beginning with the external structures. Here we find the penis, which facilitates delivery of sperm. We have the scrotum, maintains temperature for sperm production. We then have the internal structures like the testes. This is where sperm is produced, and we find testosterone. We have the epididymis, storing and maturing sperm. We have the vas deferens, where sperm is transported to the urethra. And then we will find some vesicles and some glands here as well, mainly involved in the production of seminal fluid to nourish and transport sperm. So you can look at this illustration here to familiarize yourself with the anatomy of the male reproductive system. We find the gland of the penis here. We find the testes. We have two of those. We have the epididymis, the vas deferens, where sperm travels, connecting with the seminal vesicles, going through the prostate gland, seen here, and then entering the urethra and ready to get out. Now let's look at a step-by-step explanation of the pathway of sperm from the production to ejaculation. Now, sperm is produced, as we mentioned, in the testes, within the seminiferous tubules. Perhaps it's seminiferous, but it doesn't matter. These tubules are in the testes, and this is where sperm is produced. Now, what triggers it to start producing? Well, testosterone. And testosterone is stimulated by luteinizing hormone LH from the pituitary gland. So already we're connecting the male reproductive system with our hormonal axis in general, and up in the brain, the pituitary gland. So this drives sperm production. Now sperm has been produced. It is now stored and it's beginning to mature in the epididymis, seen here. And it shares a close structure with the testes. And sperm is stored in the epididymis, where it matures and gains motility over several days. Now, sexual arousal stimulates the release of, for example, norepinephrine and other signals from our nervous system. And with this release, during sexual arousal, these signals cause smooth muscle contraction in the epididymis and the vas deferens. And these smooth contractions, muscle contractions, is what causes the sperm to move out. Now, the process of this, similar to when we talk about the movement of a bolus or food during in our intestines, we have the process of peristalsis. So peristaltic contractions in this vas deferens, in this tube here, propel the sperm towards the urethra. Now, we also mentioned that there were seminal vesicles, prostate glands, etc. involved. So there is seminal fluid added here. And the seminal vesicles, the prostate gland, for example, these add fluid to sperm, forming semen. All right, so we have the sperm here moving, once connecting to these accessory glands, like the seminal vesicles and the prostate gland, fluid is added to the sperm, forming semen. Now that we have semen, the last step is ejaculation. So rhythmic contractions of our pelvic muscles and urethra expel this sperm through the penis. And this is triggered by the sympathetic nervous system during an orgasm. So in summary, we have testosterone, which drives production. We have our nervous system signals involved, which stimulates movement during arousal. And then we have peristalsis, moving this. So now we give an explanation involving all of these different steps, but we also added the role of our central nervous system and other structures relevant to the male reproductive system. So familiarize yourself with this illustration, and let's keep going forward. So the anatomy of the female reproductive system then. Here we find the external structures like the vulva, which protects internal reproductive organs. Internal structures include the ovaries, where eggs and hormones are produced. And we find the hormones estrogen and progesterone here. Now we have the fallopian tubes, right? These transport eggs and is the site of fertilization. We have the uterus, which supports and nourishes a developing fetus. We have the cervix, which allows passage between the uterus and the vagina. And then we have the vagina, birth canal, and receptacle for sperm. So, a brief overview here. This is an anatomy course, of course, so we're not going to go too much in depth here, but we have the vagina here, we have the cervix, right? And the connection between the uterus and the vagina is this cervix here. We have the fallopian tubes, right? And then we have the ovaries here. So briefly, what happens is, during ovulation, and this is where we will connect it later to the menstrual cycle, but during ovulation, an egg will pop out and jump into this tube here. That egg will travel, and if sperm has entered, it will eventually, or should eventually, reach this egg for fertilization to occur. Once that has happened, there are a lot of processes. We will not go into it right now. This egg then will attach to the wall of the uterus, where it will implant, and this is the beginning of pregnancy. So familiarize yourself with these basic structures, and let's move ahead. Now, gametogenesis. Let's talk about spermatogenesis in males. So this occurs in the seminiferous tubules of the testes, as we mentioned before, and we produce millions of sperms daily. Here you can see an illustration of spermatogenesis. So we have the process of mitosis, creating the primary spermatocytes. And then during meiosis 1 and meiosis 2, we get these spermatids. And then these differentiate into sperms. And in females, we have oogenesis. This occurs in the ovaries and produces a single viable egg during each menstrual cycle. Now, if you feel like you need to repeat and revise, go back to our cell biology course, where we go in depth into both the process of oogenesis and spermatogenesis, and where we differentiate it from other cell division. Now, let's briefly talk about hormonal regulations. So, related to the male reproductive system, we have the hypothalamus releasing GnRH. And GnRH stands for gonadotropin releasing hormone. Now, gonadotropin releasing hormone stimulates the follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, and the luteinizing hormone, LH, from the pituitary gland. Gonadotropin releasing hormone is itself produced and released, again, by the hypothalamus. So it's important to know the steps here. Now, luteinizing hormone then stimulates testosterone production in the testes, while the follicle-stimulating hormone promotes sperm production. Now, the female reproductive system then, the gonadotropin-releasing hormone stimulates FSH and LH, right? It's the same structure. However, the follicle-stimulating hormone in females promote follicle maturation, right? And luteinizing hormone is what triggers ovulation. And in females, estrogen and progesterone regulate the menstrual cycle and prepare the uterus for implantation. So again, just to repeat, gonadotropin-releasing hormone is produced by the hypothalamus in the brain, right? Now, what are its functions? Well, it controls the release of two very important reproductive hormones: LH, luteinizing hormone, and FSH, follicle-stimulating hormone. These are released from the anterior pituitary gland. Now, how does it work? Well, gonadotropin-releasing hormone is secreted in pulses, which determines the levels and balance of LH and FSH released. So we can have faster pulses, right? Faster pulsatile release, which stimulates LH secretion. We can also have slower pulses, which stimulate FSH secretion. Now, once that is done, what does FSH and LH do in the different, in males and females? Because it differs. In males, LH stimulates testosterone production, while FSH promotes sperm production. In females, LH triggers ovulation, while FSH promotes follicle growth in the ovaries. Now let's take a deeper dive into the menstrual cycle. It is divided into different phases. We have the menstrual phase, follicular phase, ovulation, and the luteal phase. Now, if you look at this illustration up here, you will see that we have menstruation, the follicular phase, ovulation, and the luteal. Down here, we have the days, and we have the menstrual phase, the proliferative phase, secretory, and premenstrual. Now, the menstrual cycle phases can be described either in these uterine phases, down here, okay, where we have menstrual, proliferative, secretory, and premenstrual, or we can present it in the ovarian phases, up here, where we have follicular, ovulation, and the luteal. Now, these two classifications are closely related because they describe different aspects of the same cycle. Many times med students may be confused because they think these are entirely separated from one another, but no. So So let's do some comparisons and see if this holds up. So in the uterine phase, during the menstrual phase, right, there is shedding of the uterine lining, as we also described it up here. And this occurs during day 0 to day 4, or 1 to 5. Now, in the ovarian phase, this will correspond to early follicular phase, right? This is where ovarian follicles begin to grow. Now, the proliferative phase, right? In the uterine phase, as part of the uterine phase, there is a regrowth of the uterine lining, meaning the endometrium. And this occurs under the influence of estrogen during day 6 or 5-ish to day 14. And in the ovarian phase, corresponding to this late follicular phase, and this will culminate in ovulation at day 14. Then we reach the secretory phase. So, as part of the uterine phase, the endometrium thickens further. Okay? The endometrium thickens further and secretes nutrients in preparation for potential implantation. And this is driven by progesterone received from the corpus luteum. And this happens during day 14 to day 26. And this corresponds to the luteal phase of the ovary after ovulation. And now we come to the second part of the luteal phase, or the premenstrual phase. So what happens here? So if no fertilization has occurred, the corpus luteum will degenerate, causing progesterone levels to drop. And this will lead to endometrial breakdown around days 27, 28. Now, the end of the luteal phase, right, which corresponds to this, this will transition into a new cycle starting again with menstruation. So in summary, it can get a bit tricky, I know, since we are repeating the word phase a lot of times, but let's summarize the relationships again. So the menstrual phase is the early follicular phase. Then we have the proliferative phase, where late follicular phase ends, all right? So we have the early follicular phase going towards the late follicular phase, ending with ovulation. Then we come to the secretory phase, which is the part of the luteal phase. And then finally the premenstrual phase. So this is the late luteal phase, leading back to menstruation. So these phases describe synchronized ovarian and uterine changes which are necessary for reproduction. Now let's go over it again from a different angle. So let's talk or try to present the process from ovulation to whether or not there has been fertilization or not. So at the end of this cycle. So ovulation occurs here at day 14. And this is where a mature egg is released from the ovary into the fallopian tube, triggered by the surge of LH, as described here. Now we enter the so-called fertilization window. So if sperm is present here, okay, if sperm is present, then sperm meets the egg in the fallopian tubes within, let's say, 24 hours of ovulation. If there is no fertilization, then this egg that has entered here will degenerate and be reabsorbed. Now, implantation, all right, or menstruation. So if fertilization has occurred, then the fertilized egg, also known as a zygote, travels to the uterus and implants in the uterine lining. Over time, in the early process of implantation, there will be a release of something called human chorionic gonadotropin, HCG. This is what will maintain the corpus luteum, which is another part of fertilization we will go into in a different lecture and just briefly mention here. But it will maintain the corpus luteum, so the corpus luteum can maintain the secretion and continue secreting progesterone to sustain the lining, the uterine lining, for pregnancy to continue. However, if fertilization does not occur, then this corpus luteum, all right, this structure, let's say, that is responsible for maintaining the uterine lining and for maintaining fertilization to continue, this structure, if it does not receive this hormone, HCG, which comes after implantation has occurred, after fertilization has happened, then this structure, which is responsible to continue the progression of this uterine lining, of this implantation, it begins to break down. And as the corpus luteum degenerates, it will cause a drop in progesterone. And this indeed will lead to the uterine lining breaking down and is shed. This shedding is what leads to menstrual bleeding. Now let's briefly look again at fertilization and pregnancy. So here is again an illustration of the female reproductive system. Now fertilization occurs in the fallopian tubes. So these are the fallopian tubes, right? And it is connected here with the ovaries. Now, once an egg has matured and ovulation has happened, this mature egg jumps into this tube and starts to travel. And as you can see in the illustration, sperm has entered, and this sperm is moving through these tubes to find this egg. And you can see it illustrated more here. And one of these sperms will enter. Now, if it unites with this egg, then we have the formation of a zygote. Now, once that zygote has been formed, we then move on to pregnancy. So fertilization is complete. The egg has been fertilized with sperm. We have a zygote. Now, this zygote will implant, so it will continue to travel in normal conditions, of course, and implant in the uterine wall. Now, just to mention a brief example of a clinically important case could be that this implantation occurs in the tube. We have a name for these called extrauterine pregnancies, and they can be very dangerous, even deadly, and requires surgical intervention. But if everything is normal, it is supposed to implant here on the uterine wall. And over time, of course, the placenta will develop to support fetal growth. But as we mentioned in the previous slide, hormones, so HCG, progesterone, estrogen, etc., all of them are involved in sustaining pregnancy. An example was, once this zygote has implanted, after a brief few days, it starts releasing the hormone HCG that will tell the corpus luteum to maintain this lining, to keep releasing progesterone to maintain the pregnancy. If there is an implantation without fertilization, no such hormone signaling will go back. So the corpus luteum will degenerate and progesterone will drop. This uterine lining or wall um, will not be maintained, and it will eventually shed and be released, which is what we call menstrual bleeding. A fun fact, this release of this hormone in the early stages of implantation, after implantation, right? The release of HCG, which tells the corpus luteum to maintain this pregnancy. This is also the hormone we have in pregnancy tests. If you take a pregnancy test, this is what we look for. And if we discover the level necessary of HCG present, then we know there is pregnancy, because this will only be released once the zygote, after a successful fertilization has occurred, and that there is such a release to the extent where the corpus luteum can continue its work. Those levels of HCG are detectable by pregnancy tests. Now, childbirth and lactation. So childbirth is initiated by hormonal signals like oxytocin. And oxytocin plays a critical role in initiating and supporting childbirth. Now we have summaries here. So it's involved in late pregnancy. So in the preparation of birth, oxytocin has a role in the onset of labor. It follows the positive feedback loop during labor. It's involved in delivery, expelling the baby, and in postpartum recovery and bonding. So let's look at a more step-by-step explanation here. So during late pregnancy, where we're preparing for birth, there is an increase of oxytocin receptors. So towards the end of pregnancy, the uterus increases its number of oxytocin receptors, and this will make the uterus more sensitive to oxytocin. Then we have estrogen that has a crucial role. Rising estrogen levels further prime the uterus to by increasing, again, oxytocin receptor expression and stimulating uterine muscle contractions. Now we arrive at the onset of labor. So the fetus releases signals like cortisol, for example, which stimulates the placenta to produce hormones like prostaglandins. These prostaglandins soften the cervix and make uterine muscles more responsive to oxytocin. Then we have the maternal oxytocin surge. So the mother's brain, the hypothalamus, increases oxytocin production, and this is released from the posterior pituitary gland. We have uterine contraction, so oxytocin stimulates rhythmic uterine contractions, helping to push the baby towards the cervix. And as we mentioned here, there is a positive feedback loop during labor. So there will be a stretching of the cervix. So as the baby's head, right, in normal birth, when the baby's head is pressing on the cervix, stretch receptors will send signals to the brain to release more oxytocin. And this will lead to stronger and more frequent contractions, further pushing the baby down the canal. And this positive feedback loop intensifies until the baby is delivered. Now, near delivery, the oxytocin levels peak. This is to coordinate powerful contractions to expel the baby. And after the baby is born, oxytocin helps deliver the placenta by causing the uterus to contract further. We also mentioned that it is present in postpartum. So oxytocin continues to stimulate uterine contractions after birth to shrink the uterus and reduce bleeding. Furthermore, suckling by the baby stimulates further oxytocin release, promoting milk ejection. And this is through something called the let-down reflex, and also in strengthening maternal bonding. So in summary then, we have the preparation phase, right? Increasing uterine sensitivity and primes contractions. We have initiation, where uterine contractions are triggered. We have labor progression, so maintaining strengthened contractions through a positive feedback loop, increasing and increasing and increasing until the baby is out. And then in the postpartum, supporting recovery, reducing bleeding, and helping in breastfeeding. Now, that was childbirth. And let's talk about lactation then. So prolactin stimulates milk production. Oxytocin, as we mentioned, triggers milk ejection through the so-called let-down reflex. So a brief step-by-step explanation of how prolactin stimulates milk production. Well, after childbirth, the drop in estrogen and progesterone, okay, this will allow prolactin levels, which are released from the anterior pituitary, to start taking effects. Now, prolactin, all right, prolactin acts on the mammary glands, specifically stimulating milk-producing cells, also known as alveolar cells, to start producing milk. Now, suckling by the baby sends signals to the hypothalamus of the mother, increasing prolactin release for continued milk production. And then there is afterwards a supply and demand type structure where regular suckling ensures ongoing prolactin release and milk supply. So that's an overall view of the process of childbirth to lactation. Now then, some reproductive disorders. In males, we can find erectile dysfunction. We can have prostate cancer, infertility. In females, we can have polycystic ovary syndrome, endometriosis, ovarian cancer. And something in common for both is, for example, STDs can affect both symptoms, like causing HPV or by chlamydia. Now, in our pathology lectures, we will dive in depth into all of these different pathologies. Some common diagnostic tools. So in males, we use semen analysis. We can do prostate-specific antigen tests, testicular ultrasound. In females, pap smear, pelvic ultrasound, hormone blood tests, etc. So in summary then, the reproductive system enables gamete production, fertilization, and support for fetal development. Hormonal regulation is critical for reproductive function and maintaining cycles. Understanding disorders and diagnostic methods is essential for clinical care. And that's the end of this lecture. Continue now to Chapter 11.